Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first SharePoint webinar for 2017, State of SharePoint. We're going to look at some of the changes from 2016 and also look at some of the things that we can expect for this year. We are still waiting on for perhaps a couple more folks, and then we'll get started right away. At this point, you should be able to see my screen. You should be looking at a PowerPoint deck, and let me know if you're having any audio difficulty. We've got two folks on standby to assist with any audio and video issues. Thank you. All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. My name is Raul Ravindran, Chief Technology Officer with Global Infinite, as well as our lead SharePoint architect. I'm also a VTSP with Microsoft, specializing in SharePoint and Azure. So today we're going to look at both SharePoint Online and SharePoint Server 2016. So some of the changes I'm going to talk about, it's specific to SharePoint Online, whereas everything else would apply in both areas. But I'll try and call out when we get into any specific scenario that's unique to each environment. At any point in time, if you've got questions, feel free to use the Skype meeting chat window. You should be able to type in the chat. You might be muted when we begin here, but as the course of the presentation, feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions. All right. I figured a good place to start might be to take a step back and review one of the graphic that Microsoft shared with us sometime in 2015. And at the time, we were still in the tail end of SharePoint Server 2013, and they're beginning to talk about SharePoint Server Online and SharePoint Server 2016. And one of the key components that came out of that discussion was the concept of cloud-inspired experiences and the hybrid integration. So there's a lot of focus in SharePoint Online, a lot of momentum behind Office 365, which in turn is channeling to SharePoint Server 2016 and SharePoint Online as well, which is great for a couple of key reasons. One, we can now expect more faster and frequent SharePoint releases in both environments. SharePoint has since then shifted to a feature pack release model, and I think the first feature pack for SharePoint Server 2016 was sometime in November, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But more importantly, for SharePoint Online, there is pretty much an update every other month, and throughout the presentation, I'll kind of make a reference to some of the changes that's incoming and how you can keep track of it. So there's a whole roadmap page that we will review together to get a better understanding.
So you get the 250,000 retention on any one loss. The 1 million is an additional retention. But
so the first thing I figured would be of a key interest is the improved cross-collaboration platform. I mean, that's been one of the primary focus for Microsoft in general. So the new Microsoft mantra is mobile first, cloud first, and one of the key driving factors for that is having a consistent engagement model across not just mobile devices, but also other operating systems, other browsers that's strictly not Microsoft, and from a SharePoint side of the story, one of the bigger enhancements that you might have seen in SharePoint Online, if you're on Office 365 especially, is a greater focus on, I guess, what we call a touch focus interface. So by default, when you attempt to navigate the same pages in a different form factor, you can notice a general change in layout and font. Nearly all pages in SharePoint Online and SharePoint Server 2016 are responsive by nature, and this applies to not just the landing page and a couple of the lists and libraries, but it applies to pretty much every single area in SharePoint Server 2016. In addition to that, if a responsive design in and itself is not enough for you, we've also seen the release of SharePoint Mobile App. So it first was announced back in, I think, the tail end of the 2015 area, and then the first announcement for iOS mobile app was in sometime in May. So the iOS app came in first, and then in the last couple of months, we have seen the release of the SharePoint mobile app for Android, as well as SharePoint mobile app for Windows 10 devices. So a couple of interesting items here. The mobile app for SharePoint mobile platforms is not just a responsive design view of the same pages. This is in fact a full-on native app. What that means is, regardless of the design of or the structuring of your site or navigation, the user experience of navigating between sites and document library is going to be pretty much consistent regardless of the design aspects of your site. The only area where design would have a greater impact would be for when you actually view the web page. So at any point in time, you can navigate to a site, click on the little home icon, and it'll redirect you to the actual design page of your site. But apart from that, you can see kind of how in this specific screenshot, we're looking at a listing of sites. Clicking on a site will allow you to see the activities and documents, and I'm going to skip back to one of the previous screenshots here. In this instance, you're looking at an activity stream for the sales and marketing site. You can also see there is a files and lists links tab at the top. What this means is the files and links will allow you to navigate through documents and lists without any specific customization or any kind of a changes breaking the experience. And the same concept applies for all three devices. So that's kind of cool. We have a native mobile app to surface SharePoint resources with the authentication, the security model still following whatever you have implemented on the server side. So if you've got corporate devices today that's corporate approved devices to employees with a single sign-in mechanism, that's going to carry on to the mobile app as well, because the authentication authorization model is still using a Office and Work account or an enterprise account or using a Microsoft account, so that the same technologies would continue to power this experience as well. Another neat feature that came in towards the tail end of 2016 was modern document and list library. And the list library changes might not be reflected in your tenant just yet if you're on Office 365. It's still being rolled out, but it has been released. However, the modern document library has been out for a while now, and if you haven't seen it already, I figured I'll take a quick step back and allow you to see how it looks like in action. So here's a standard SharePoint document library, and you can see how the look and feel of the document library is completely changed. It's a lot cleaner. Any of the cluttering from your navigation or left-hand side tree view will not carry over to this view. But when this release hits SharePoint Server 2016, you can in fact customize the master pages powering some of this experience to tailor it to more of your corporate branding if you have customized your SharePoint instances. Some of the cool features of the new document library platform are, so you're already used to, I assume, SharePoint document library views and how you can create custom views. But in addition to that, you also have a tiles view, which is pretty useful when, especially when used in conjunction with Office Online Server or Office Web App Server. That allows you to see real-time thumbnails and screenshots of all of your documents. So especially if you're looking at like a media asset library or a digital asset library, sales and marketing content, this can be pretty useful. It's pretty easy to go ahead and create your new documents and content types just like you've been used to in the past. But some of the key interesting changes is how to get to tagging and metadata of a document quickly by hitting the little information icon here on the top right. and you can see how it quickly opens up document information such as who's made the document, who's changed it. You can also browse through the document directly on the right-hand side pane, and hopefully you can see how I'm browsing through the document just by using the scroll bar of my mouse here. And I can also see the properties. So this is kind of very useful if, let's say, you've added a custom tag or a category for a document, and you want a quick and easy way to edit a document without going to a whole separate page and taking 5-6 clicks just to change a small aspect of the document. So all of that's now possible on the right-hand side little bar here. And you can also keep track of some of the recent activity like version history and other information. In addition to that, I'm going to go back to my list view here. You can also quickly and easily add custom content types, like for example a link. So we are here in the finance document library, but if I wanted to link back to one of a previous document in a different site, I can still add my shortcuts and hyperlinks very easily, but it's all maintained in pretty much the same format. And you also have access to all of the previous functions. There has been some changes in this layout and placement, so you might want to watch out for that. But by and large, it retains pretty much all the functionality of what's now referred to as the classic SharePoint document library. Quick side note here, if you'd like to get to the document library settings, you'd have to use the little gear icon on the top right hand side and go to library settings. Unlike in the past, we were used to seeing the settings and other custom functionality pop up on the ribbon here. That's now being changed a little bit, and it's spread across a smaller ribbon bar here and the gear icon here. So there's still a little bit more changes to talk about, but we're going to switch to a separate topic here where we will talk about how this can integrate better with Flow and Power Apps. But one more thing I think is worth highlighting is a new pin to top feature. So if in any given document library, especially if you're looking at a bigger document library with multiple folders and further hierarchy there, it might be difficult to surface all the most commonly accessed documents. So having a little pin feature here allows someone with the appropriate permission rights to pin documents that's most important to you, so it minimizes extra navigation or trying to figure out which is the latest version of a document. You can just rely on the pinned documents on the top here. So hopefully that was kind of an interesting insight into the new document library experience. It should be rolled out to SharePoint Server 2016 as well. Another cool capability that rolled out for SharePoint Online early last year was the new sensitive content protection. So when SharePoint Server 2016 was first launched, it had about, I think, 51 or so information types. So this was kind of useful for creating data loss prevention policies or using eDiscovery to find documents or other pieces of information spread across your SharePoint sites and OneDrive sites based on specific information types that's built in. So for example, if you're trying to see, hey, do I have any kind of credit card information or social security number anywhere in any document or site or pages or list in anywhere in my SharePoint platform, previously a question like that was kind of hard to figure out, or it required configuration of custom search patterns, and you had to use advanced pattern matching, and it was just a hassle to try and do all those manually. There are third-party product support for sensitive content matching, but that also requires some extra configuration steps and was not necessarily intuitive, and on top of that had extra licensing costs associated with it. With a new model, you now have got all of these information content types built into the platform. So I can quickly show you an example of that. So for example, if in the Office 365 world, you can use a new Security and Compliance Center to get to a, uh, a policies area where you can find and fine-tune DLP policies. But if you're used to using e-discovery, you can also use pretty much all of the same filtering patterns in that page as well. So I'm in the data loss prevention area under security and compliance, and the way you get to it and the interface is going to look a little different between 2016 on-prem and online, but the policies in itself. So for example, a common use case is just social security number or personally identifiable information. So things like a passport number or social security numbers are a built-in information type that you can select and define further policies here, and you can also set up rules at a document library level where you could flat out say, hey, this document library cannot contain any content that matches one or more information type policies as defined. And the same filters here can also be used in conjunction with search. So not only are you setting up a DLP policy, these policies can also be used to cast a wide sweep over all of your content and try and find if you've got any offending documents. And if you do, if you find some content that's breaking some of those rules, you can choose to just soft hide it, if you will, where the document still exists, but the author of the document can be notified and said, hey, you can't have this document. We're marking it as a private document now. Go ahead and fix it and try to re-upload the document. Or you can flat out delete the document and not allow a document to be uploaded with if it's matching one or more sensitive content types. So this has got a lot of implications from a legal perspective, or if you're trying to do an audit, and it's just an easier way to spit out reports like this that previously used to be had a lot of manual effort. Another interesting change, which I think was not very well advertised. A lot of clients, especially when we engage with our Office 365 customers, after the rollout of an initial intranet portal, their next big concern is, hey, how do I use SharePoint for external client collaboration? And it depending on your business model, you may have a simple business-to-business kind of an engagement, or you might be opening up your portal to several hundreds of thousands of users from either a strictly read-only standpoint or for two-way client collaboration. So especially for Office 365 small business and small business premium customers, the limit of external user sharing has been increased from 500 to unlimited, and for all other plans with SharePoint, it is now also unlimited. So that's kind of I thought was an interesting change, because we had some instances where the 500 and the limits in itself was a little bit of cumbersome, because it required the maintenance and other overhead to make sure we stay under that limit. Another cool capability is the new site dashboard, and I call it a site dashboard. That's not the official name, but in the past, there's an interesting change in approach. We always recommended having your intranet portal page as your landing page, but we are now seeing a widespread use of SharePoint team sites and community sites and project sites, which kind of creates a disparity in a good way, but information in several other team sites. But it would be a little hard to try and keep track of all of them. And if you're in a higher level role where you have access to several team sites, and that becomes even harder, especially for IT personnel or a a team member from a shared services department role like HR or marketing, you may be involved in several projects at the same time, and as a result several team sites. So you now have a one-stop view to see all the team sites you're associated with. And when I say team sites in this context, I mean any SharePoint site or a sub-site. So it could be a team site, could be a project site, it could be a BI site. Regardless, you can subscribe to them manually, and you can do that by hitting the top right-hand side follow button at the site level, or you can manually pin sites and kind of have this available on a dashboard level, or you can SharePoint will automatically list out sites that you have interacted that you frequently interact with. So you can see here in this example, I've got a frequent sites at the top here and a suggested sites here. This allows me to figure out that hey, it looks like SharePoint is suggesting that I keep track of the sales and marketing site because either I interact with a lot of documents in that site, or a team member of the sales and marketing site has given me access recently, and it's being pulled up here. So this is an alternative to a intranet portal landing page as the home page kind of deal. And it can be very useful to keep track of multiple sites in one shot. This feature is not yet in SharePoint Server 2016. Not entirely certain if it's coming out in a feature pack 2 or was involved in part 1, so I need to double check on that. But the template in itself is still available for you to download and use. Speaking of feature pack, so like I said a while ago, the new SharePoint deployment and release cycle have a change in approach. So until SharePoint Server 2013, we were used to seeing what I like to call a big bang release at the at the end of each cycle. You have SharePoint Server 2010, 2013, and 2016, and that's it. And there were some minor changes here and there, but mostly we were limited to standard service packs, and that was predominantly just fixing issues versus introduction of new features. But that model has since been shifted, especially in SharePoint 2016. It now closely resembles the Windows 10 update cycle, where instead of a major operating system release, we are now seeing builds rolling out every quarter with significant feature updates. So the original SharePoint Server 2016 Feature Pack 1 was, I think, scheduled for late 2016, but it was launched about a month early. And the first feature pack is it's got a lot of enhancements, but it's also got a lot of focus on just feature fixes in itself. But a couple of the new enhancements are the administrative actions logging module. So this is interesting because you can now have multiple farm admins and keep track of the activities that they're using in the SharePoint admin console. So that used to be kind of a black box, because if something broke, we had no idea what happened, if it's associated with an action. So it's not necessarily just a security feature. It's also a good tool to keep track of changes, so it'd be easier to troubleshoot. Another one of my personal favorite feature is enhancements to min-roll. So if you're not following SharePoint Server updates in the past, you may have noticed that between Server 2013 and 2016, there's been a significant change in how you install and configure SharePoint servers in general. Up until 2013, you basically had a baseline SharePoint server install, and it was really up to you to go to each server and configure specific components such as search or BI or the distributed cache. It really was focused on what I like to call a services oriented configuration versus a proper deployment topology, and that created some interesting problems. One of the big ones were despite having dedicated web front-end servers, we still install web servers on the app servers and on a BI server, which kind of created a little bit of an issue in having a minimal topology. So MinRole was initially launched to solve some of those pain points where you can now have a true dedicated front-end server, a dedicated search server or a cache server, and a couple more server types that's built into the installation model. One of the challenge was to fully take advantage of it, you needed to create a bigger SharePoint farms, and we'll talk about that, and that's since been improved as well. A few other things that may not be of great interest unless you are in a hybrid configuration model. So if you've got your existing SharePoint 2013 or 2016 in a hybrid configuration, with the new feature pack, you can now have a single taxonomy, which I think is the biggest change, driving both SharePoint Online and SharePoint Server on-prem. So this is huge for customers who rely on term stores and managed metadata. So previously in the past, you needed to come up with your own mechanism to make sure that your taxonomy and your term stores and your navigation stayed in sync between in a hybrid configuration between SharePoint Online and SharePoint On-Prem. But with the feature pack release, you can now have a single farm level term store set that can be synced between both instances. Another cool enhancement, it's fairly minor, but I think it's kind of interesting, is the ability to have custom app launcher tiles. So if you truly wanted to create a one-stop shop for your organization, for not just SharePoint, but for all your application, you can customize the app tiles to include all of your internal applications. So you can truly make your SharePoint portal landing page as the default page and allow your employees to click on the custom app launcher tiles and navigate to third-party applications or even internal links in SharePoint. So some of the cool changes there. So like I said, I think the min-roll change is one of the more significant change if you're at least thinking about a SharePoint Server 2016 installation, or if you're planning to upgrade to the new version here. You no longer need technically a four SharePoint Server topology to take advantage of it. From a strictly technical standpoint, you didn't actually need a 4 server topology, but to fully take advantage of MinRoll, you kind of have to at least have 4 servers to create a highly available SharePoint farm, and that was largely because you would need a distributed cache as well as a front-end server and search, but by the time you get to your third instance, you needed multiple SharePoint servers to achieve kind of the same thing. But a very common SharePoint deployment topology is having front-end servers who also act as caching servers, and application servers to act as search servers as well. So typically, app server workloads are split between search, user profile synchronization, workflow executions, and in some cases BI work. But search by and large is the most resource taxing example of an application server. So in the previous model, you would have a search server as well as an app server for handling workflows and some of the other background processing kind of activities. But it really didn't make sense to have an extra server for some minor details to follow the min-roll infrastructure. In the new model, you're no longer limited to having a multi-server major farms for something trivial like a medium two farm instance. So very useful for organizations with, I think, about 2,000 employees or less. You really don't need a major 6 or 8 server SharePoint farms, you can get away with merging some of these roles into the same server, depending on your workload. So those are some of the quick changes in 2016. Now, obviously, when we talk about 2016 and changes, there's a lot more we can talk about overall, but a lot of those changes were already available in SharePoint Online prior to 2016. Although SharePoint Server 2016 was launched last year, many of these changes were already in SharePoint Online. So I decided not to talk about them, but there are some interesting changes, such as the new video platform for Office 365. It's strictly not SharePoint, but it's something that we get asked a lot, is how can I have video streaming or store media content on SharePoint? And SharePoint Online has had the support for a while. We also got full-on BI integration and a mobile first design approaches, so you can have a highly responsive design right out the gate with SharePoint Online, and have that experience, be part of the design from the get-go here. So you can see how, as I change my UI, it automatically adjusts to my form factor, and search has been improved as well. But many of these changes came in before 2016, so I'm not going to talk about it. But I did want to share one link here that if you're trying to keep track of SharePoint, go ahead and view the office.com roadmap page. It's going to list a lot of Office 365 stuff, but many of the items listed in this page will also apply to SharePoint Server 2016. So this is probably the best one-stop shop to see the changes that's being rolled out and what to expect in the near future. So if you filter down to SharePoint here, you can kind of get a full snapshot of all of the previously released items, and you can see there's quite a bit here, and I haven't necessarily talked about all of them. But more importantly, in the in development and rolling out tabs here, you can keep track of things that are about to be released, so you can be better prepared to handle them. Now, for SharePoint on-prem customers, your updates are strictly driven through SharePoint feature packs, so you have better control in terms of anticipating and reacting to different changes. But with SharePoint Online, it's a direct change every time an update has been done. So if you have made customizations, so if you relied on the actual UI in itself, you might want to keep track of this page. All right. So moving on to 2017, like I said, the biggest change to watch out for, and we saw some of these changes in 2016, is the hybrid integration, but it's not done yet. In 2016, between SharePoint Server 2016 and SharePoint Online, we saw a unified team site navigation, unified UI. So in the Office 365 world, you had the little blue bar in the top with a tile launcher and an app launcher, and to create a consistent navigation experience. That's pretty much the UI pattern for SharePoint Server 2016 as well. In addition to that, we also had two-way team site linking, so you could have links and displayed between SharePoint Server 2016 and SharePoint Online for team sites. You can also have the SharePoint Online search also crawl SharePoint on-prem search results, so you had a consistent search experience, as well as the taxonomy integration now. So those are some of the things that's already been have already been rolled out in a hybrid configuration. But moving forward, we're now looking at more interesting changes, as for example, Microsoft Flow, the new workflow platform, can work with SharePoint list data both on-prem and online, and it can work across both environments and have links between both environments, so users don't necessarily have to care about how their workflows are being executed. BI integration is also now two ways, especially if you rely on Power BI. You can now have a consistent BI experience on both platforms. And we are also seeing the rollout of new security and content compliance features being integrated between both platforms. We're going to talk about some of them in the next couple of pages here, but the hybrid model is something to watch out for um, in two key areas. If you're already a customer on SharePoint Server 2013 or 2016 and you're thinking about how to move to the cloud, this is a good stopgap, right? Especially if you've got a lot of content, it's not easy to get to SharePoint Online with a flick of a switch, but you can upgrade your team sites using a strict database approach, get to 2016, get a hybrid configuration going, and have a phased migration or upgrade plan if your end goal is Office 365. Some for other customers like SharePoint Online, but they got limitations for some resources, but they would like to leverage it, but they can't move all of their content to the online world. One key example here is if you deal with large files. So the new SharePoint Server 2016 and online limit is 10 GB per file, but obviously you can't stream a 10 GB file every time you want to open it from an online location. It makes more sense to keep those kinds of resources on-prem. So depending on a hybrid configuration, you can have some of those experiences going. I'm actually going to just skip over this real quick because we already talked about most of them except for compliance and reporting, and this is something that's some of them have already been rolled out, but more changes are coming. But I'm going to skip over this for now. So some of the new changes that's coming up in 2017 is the new, so I'm going to refer to as modern team sites and modern pages. So this is a little bit different than the team site that you may be used to in the past. So team site, when strictly viewed as a SharePoint site template, just like all the other site templates, makes a lot of sense. But in the SharePoint Online world, team sites are now spanning across services. So for example, creating a team site in the new SharePoint Online instance will also create an Office 365 group. You can also create a planner group. You can also create a Yammer group as well. So activity streams from multiple services can be merged into a single team site, where a team site may only be used for document collaboration. You may use Yammer or some of the other services for strictly discussions or other collaboration elements. So the new team site experience, I don't have a demo necessarily to show you, is it's going to come up, I believe, in the first half of this year. In a limited rollout, some of these team site changes has already been made available to some tenants, but a broader rollout is coming up in 2017. Another cool feature, and this is an entirely new capability that a lot of users are getting excited about, is the new page design feature. So if you look at the current landscape of customizing SharePoint pages, you can either have a SharePoint site page, drag and drop web parts, and go that route, or you can have a SharePoint content editor and really go crazy with styling and designing and adding JavaScript or CSS. And, we don't recommend that, but we also understand that in some cases your hands are tied. I mean, really, that's probably the fastest way to get your results. Or you can create standard HTML pages and load them to SharePoint instances, but that creates kind of an awkward user experience because it may not follow all of the styling elements of the SharePoint CSS files. So it creates kind of a disparity between the out-of-the-box SharePoint pages and your custom pages. So a easy way to customize SharePoint pages without a lot of web design knowledge or without using SharePoint design Design Manager is, I'm sorry, SharePoint Designer is a new, what I'm going to call as a modern pages feature. So you may notice that, and this has also been rolled out for a few tenants, if you go ahead and create a new page, you get a slightly different experience. It's not your usual, enter title and enter content kind of thing. You see how it's it looks visually different, and it has a more website page look and feel versus the usual SharePoint web part driven interface. So what's cool about this is you can still use web parts. So if you still want to display a calendar or a discussion board, you can do that. But the layout is a lot more flexible, and the focus is more on the design and content entry versus strictly web parts. And this feature is also slated for full rollout in the first half of this year. SharePoint Analytics has been talked about quite a lot, and in part, the document analytics and site analytics have already been rolled out, but there's a lot of enhancements coming this year, and it has been one of the most requested features where usage analytics at a document level was severely lacking. So, for example, if you wanted to answer a question like, "Hey, how many users have accessed a piece of document within my team site, and how can I keep track of who viewed what kind of thing?" That used to be a little difficult, and those kinds of questions have in part already been answered in the 2016 and SharePoint Online rollouts, but it's going to get enhanced with higher level dashboards like the tenant and farm level analytics. So this allows you to see a dashboard of your entire tenant, and some of this information is also available for SharePoint Server 2016 as backend data models, but obviously if you're on SharePoint Online, you're going to see a lot more than just SharePoint data. But more importantly, we talked about site activities and site dashboard in our previous set, but this is also being rolled out for SharePoint Online world, but it's coming up for SharePoint Server 2016. A lot of this feature is already there, but some of the enhancements like trending content and increased data models are also coming up very soon. I don't have an exact date yet, but for example, if I go to my portal, and let's say I'm going to pick a site like the finance site, and if I go down to the usual site contents page, you'll notice that it's going to show me, well, first off, the experience is different, but it's also showing me site visits and trending content. Now, unfortunately, I launched this site specifically for this webinar very recently, so you're not going to see any analytics just yet, but yeah, document level analytics and site level analytics are now have a more prominent place, and you can keep track of user activity within your site, so you can make better decisions on, hey, if no one's coming to my site, why is that? Or if they're accessing a specific document library or a piece of content, or if no one's accessing a document, you can answer some of these questions on why and have increased insight into kind of the depth of information within your own sites. Document analytics is, I don't have a better screenshot. This kind of just shows you kind of like a trend of all the documents, but behind the scenes, at each document, we have a better usage analytics model that you can't quite see on the UI, but if you want to build out a custom report or a custom application like putting out a new policy and procedure document and making sure that everyone has read it, those kinds of questions can now be answered using the new document analytics data models. Lastly, especially for SharePoint Online, you will now have a increased analytics at a user level. So this is very useful for as an individual, especially if you use Office 365 email and SharePoint to store your content. This is a great way to see user level analytics. So one of the questions I get asked a lot, especially when we talk about the future of SharePoint, is what about forms and workflows, right? Especially InfoPath forms have been kind of a sticking point for a while, where it's being deprecated way back in I think 2013, but has not had a full-on successor for 2016 or even SharePoint Online. But late last year, Microsoft announced that Power Apps is going to be the closest successor to InfoPath Forms, which is a little interesting because Power Apps is not a strictly one-to-one feature parity in with InfoPath Forms. Um, it You also can't expect to have all the same features. So, for example, it it does not have a backend C# model for you to customize some specific piece of content. It's not compatible with InfoPath Forms for your mobile devices. So if you want to see Power App Forms, you have to rely on the dedicated Power Apps viewing platform. But that being said, the it's still in the initial rollout. There is not yet a migration path from InfoPath to the Power Apps platform. So some of the details are still a little murky here, but hopefully we'll start seeing more of a feature parity between both platforms. But if you're thinking about creating a new form, um, it's probably a safe bet at this stage, especially if you're on SharePoint Online, to go ahead and try out Power Apps versus SharePoint List Forms or InfoPath Forms, which InfoPath Form services have also been deprecated in SharePoint Online. So if you wanted to create a server-driven InfoPath Forms, your options are either Power App, SharePoint List Forms, or you may need to rely on third-party products such as Nintex. So I don't have a direct Power App integrated list just yet, so I figured I'll just show you some of this from a screenshot standpoint. So imagine a SharePoint standard list, and I know the look and feel of the list is more consistent with the new modern document library view, but the list views are also being updated to reflect that state, and it's not yet rolled out to my demo tenant, but you may have already seen it. So integrating with Power App is fairly straightforward. So you can see how there's a Create Power App shortcut here, and then it takes you to a Power App Designer, and you can create a mobile view or a desktop view, whatever you like. And it's a fairly intuitive interface. Add validations and checks, and make sure that it is connected to a list. And you can also create lookup drop-downs from multiple lists or even non-SharePoint data sources. Create your model and publish it back to your site, so you can kind of have a mini app for a lot of simple operations like a leave request form or an expense report, that kind of thing. You can roll these kinds of forms out very quickly with Power Apps. Another question I get asked a lot is what about workflows? So first off, the existing SharePoint workflows and also the Workflow Manager platform are not going away. They're still probably your first preference for creating any kind of workflows in SharePoint, and it is continuing to be supported. There is zero fear of that. The Microsoft Flow platform is probably a safer bet, especially for SharePoint Online customers. If you are trying to create workflows, not just limited to SharePoint, but increasingly with the introduction of Dynamics 365 or Dynamics CRM, we are starting to see more of the Dynamics product line as well as additional services being rolled into the Office 365 world. So if you'd like to have an integration layer with a workflow between multiple services, Microsoft Flow is probably a better bet to create some of those experiences. If you're an on-prem customer, continue using Workflow Manager or a SharePoint Workflows platform, it is still a better choice for most intents and purposes. But if you have a hybrid connectivity model, or if there's a specific reason to use Microsoft Flow, especially if you've got let's say some resources on Microsoft Azure, for instance, and you need to connect to multiple data models, you can still use Flow to connect with SharePoint on-prem data. So if you've got a list in SharePoint on-prem and a list in Dynamics 365 in the Office 365 world, you can still create a single workflow that can tie in to both of these areas. So I can quickly show you how Flow and Power Apps could look like. So you can see how you can start start creating a simple workflow from scratch here, but for the purpose of our discussion, I'm just going to go ahead and choose from a template, and there's quite a bit of template that covers some interesting scenarios. The icons on the left of each template kind of showcases the different services that it interacts with, and you'll notice that in some of these cases, especially here, it is also tying into products and services that's outside of Office 365 or even Microsoft in general. So there's a lot of interesting little use cases here, and if something doesn't fit your bill, you can always create a simple web service that can tie into a custom data source in your organization and have that powering a SharePoint list. So for example, if you've got a database today within your organization and it's got some tables and some information that you need to create a form for like a drop-down, you can create a very simple wrapper around it in the form of a web service, or use one of the existing third-party connectors, and have that available along with the Microsoft Flow to connect both instances. So there's quite a bit of different ways to get to integrate with multiple different data platforms, especially in the SharePoint Online world. Give a shot with Flow. It was recently taken out of preview, so it's now production ready from Microsoft side. And the last bit is Flow works very well with Power Apps. And if you're trying to create especially custom forms, especially for remote users, if you're trying to create like a form that a user can pull up on their mobile device, or see a list of customers, or add a new lead while they're on the road, form, or any other kind of form need, the Power Apps platform is a much better area to kind of create some of these things. So you can see how this is a dedicated app that's built as available as a part of a template like an expense tracker, and this kind of an app can be made available quickly to a mobile app with a SharePoint list powering the backend for a data source. So lots of different templates here, and all of Power Apps, or some of the Power Apps are under the Dynamics 365 umbrella, but by and large they can still work with SharePoint and as well as third-party data sets. So give this a shot. Very useful to create quick and simple line of business applications without investing in full-on custom solutions, especially if you use SharePoint today as your primary intranet portal. So I think that kind of takes us to the end of our presentation here. There's still a lot more we can talk about, but I think by and large, the two key takeaways are, SharePoint Server on-prem customers, watch out for feature packs. That's going to be your new model of deploying new features into SharePoint platform. We're quickly moving away from multiple releases in the form of service packs or 3-year upgrade cycles. Instead, we're going to rely on feature packs that's going to roll out every other month. or at least once every half an year or a quarter. For SharePoint Online customers, make sure that you go and visit office.com /roadmap. It's your one-stop shop to see all kinds of new and upcoming features. And I missed out on showcasing one more thing here. If you go to sharepoint.uservoice.com, this is a great place also to keep track of potential upcoming things. So typically, the top ideas with the highest votes have a higher chance of making it into Office 365 or SharePoint on-prem, especially if you can see kind of how there's tags of some items where they're working on it. So this is also a great way to keep track of new and upcoming features. So that being said, I'll open up the floor for any questions. But for everyone else, thank you very much for joining this webinar this morning. We will send out a copy of this deck as a part of a follow-up email. And if you can think of any other questions later on, feel free to reply to that email with your questions, concerns, or if you'd like a meeting for a custom consultation to talk about an upgrade, migration, custom development, or any other SharePoint related work. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.